Hey guys, this is Red Dead Railroad, and I have a very special video today. These two projects have been in the works for quite a while now, and I've been planning on doing them for a very long time. And so I'm very excited to finally be able to share these projects that I've been working on. And to preface before we get too much into the video, I do want to say this has been recorded outside. I haven't been able to get outside too much with work lately, and I did not want to spoil a nice, beautiful day by recording inside. So if you hear birds and stuff like that in the background, you're not going crazy. I just recorded it outside. But anyways, without further ado, here's the projects of the Jupiter and 119. Now, I should mention, I have always had an interest in these locomotives. Ever since I got into the hobby when I was, like 11 or 12 years old or so, right around there, I immediately had an interest for old-time steam locomotives. I think I can probably attribute that to my grandpa. He always was into the Old West and stuff like that, so I think that's really where the old-time aesthetic really became of interest for me. And when I got into the hobby, I immediately kind of gravitated towards the old-time models. And really, the only available products for that time period when I was getting into the hobby were the Bachmann 440s. Basically, no other manufacturers really had anything that I could find other than Athearn, and I really had an interest in the old-time stuff, so I had initially bought two models that were actually really old. They were from like the 1970s, because they had the old red livery for the Jupiter and the old outdated 119 livery as well, which I believe is how those engines were painted up until the 1990s when they repainted the locomotives, which we'll get into later on in the video. But I had the old tender drive models. They were fine. They're a good entry point to the hobby, but I always wanted to have better models. And I'm finally now gotten around to having more accurate models of the Jupiter and 119. So let's get into it. Also, I want to give a quick shout out to Andrew K4. As I was originally working on this video, I could not remember who had initially created this video here called Bettering Your Bachmann. I had looked in my search history on YouTube and could not find it. I looked in my watch history on YouTube, could not find it. I searched it on YouTube, could not find it, and I could not remember who uploaded it until I had actually made a post with my completed Jupiter and 119 models, and he ended up commenting on it. And so luckily, I can credit him for his work now because he is the inspiration behind these custom locomotives I ended up building. And without the work he had done in that video, I probably wouldn't have gotten the inspiration to customize these locomotives myself. So thanks again to Andrew, and go check out his channel. Check out that video, and subscribe to his channel too, because he does some phenomenal work on his channel. Thanks again, Andrew. Now, to go over the history of the locomotives briefly, the Jupiter was built by the Schenectady Locomotive Works in 1868 for the Central Pacific Railroad. The locomotive was made famous as being one half of the locomotives at the Golden Spike ceremony in 1869. The engine was ultimately scrapped in the early 1900s after it had been noted as being a historic locomotive, because it had been rebuilt and sold to other railroads numerous times after its 1869 appearance in Promontory. The 119 was a similar story, built in 1868 by the Rogers Locomotive Works. It was built for the Union Pacific Railroad and was the other half of the participant locomotives in the Golden Spike ceremony of 1869. The engine, like the Jupiter, was scrapped in the early 1900s. After the scrapping of both locomotives, the engines were portrayed by other locomotives, such as the Virginia and Truckee Reno, Inyo, Dayton, Genoa. They had quite a few notable locomotives acting in as them. But these locomotives, despite looking pretty similar to the part, were not the actual things. So in the 1970s, O'Connor Engineering out of California was contracted to produce replicas of the Jupiter and 119 locomotives. And in 1979, the two replicas were ready. The locomotives had been painted by Ward Kimball himself. For those of you that recognize that name, Ward Kimball was a lead animator for Disney, and he also had quite the extensive interest in railroading, owning his own Grizzly Flats narrow gauge railroad. The Jupiter was originally painted red, while the 119 looks fairly similar to how it looks now. However, in the 1990s, a newspaper was discovered from the 1860s, which had actually described how the Jupiter looked around the time of the Golden Spike. It was discovered that the locomotive actually had a crimson and blue appearance, inspired by the Caledonian Railway. The 119 also got some paint improvements as well to make it a bit more accurate with findings that had been found of Rogers locomotives at that time period, and the locomotives pretty much look the exact same now as they did in the 1990s. Now, onto the Bachmann 440 prototype. Now, the Bachmann 440 models have been widely known as the Jupiter and 119 models. However, they actually aren't based on either prototype. The locomotives are rather based on Virginia and Truckee locomotives. I can't really find exactly which one, but I believe it was either the Inyo, the Reno, or the Genoa. However, regardless, these locomotives are pretty close to the ones that were seen at Promontory. Interestingly enough, these Virginia and Truckee locomotive prototypes actually all did play the Jupiter and 119 at one point, so it isn't totally far-fetched that these locomotives are painted as the Jupiter and 119. Now, onto the models. Bachmann has done a pretty good job of replicating these locomotives, however, they had some questionable choices, particularly with the Jupiter. Looking at the Jupiter, the boiler is the first thing that stands out as being horrifically wrong. It's just way too bright of a silver instead of the more darkish gray Russia iron that the actual Jupiter replica has. Also incorrect on the Jupiter model is the steam dome, the tender truck colors, the boiler brace colors which connect the pilot to the smoke box, and the wood load isn't very realistic looking. I will note, however, I have not gotten to actually replacing the wood load yet as of this video. I plan to cut up some real wood and to put that in the tender. However, that's an update that'll have to wait for another time. Now on to the 119. Now the 119 is actually a bit more accurate, however, there's still quite a few issues with it. The thing that usually looks wrong to me at first when looking at one of these models is the bell and the cab. The bell is a very crude looking representation of the actual ornate bell on the 119 replica. This is a holdover from the old 70s tooling. I'm honestly shocked they didn't retool the bell or at least try to make it look a bit better, but I can understand the issue with that because if they tried to make it out of plastic, it would be very, very fragile. And the second thing is the cab. I don't really know why, but they went with kind of a bright beige for the cab instead of a darker wood-stained color. That always throws me off as well. Additionally, again, the trucks and the wheels and the tender, not the right colors. And also another thing that's kind of weird is the gold painted cap on the stack. The 119 would also need pinstriping on all of its wheels as well, which is kind of odd that Bachmann didn't do that because they have other 440s that were retooled that have pinstriping on the wheels. So kind of odd for them to leave it off, but that's just another thing for me to fix. Now with all those issues pointed out, let's get into fixing these models and making them look a lot more accurate to their proper prototypes. Let's start with the Central Pacific Jupiter, as this is the locomotive I actually started with the projects on. The tender trucks needed to be painted blue, and I should mention, for all the painting on this project, I ended up using gloss acrylic paints. I don't have an airbrush at the moment, and if you thin the paints out with water, you will not see any brush strokes, and they actually come out looking really good. Anyways, though, I ended up using real blue for the tender trucks and real red for the tender wheels. I had also ended up painting the headlight red because Bachmann had neglected to do so as well. I took the boiler off, and I ended up making a special mix out of this gunmetal gray and this gloss black. I mixed it to try and replicate Russia iron. It's not super perfect. I never really tried to replicate Russia iron before. However, I think this came out pretty good for a first try. I do need to figure out how to get the finish to look a bit shinier. I used a basic matte sealer for this. I had a few people tell me I should use some sort of like wax finish on it, to make it look more shiny. I'm going to try to do that at some point. I need to figure out what I need to use to accomplish that effect still. But for the time being, I think that the Russia iron came out pretty good, especially for a first attempt. I also repainted the boiler braces and added an engineer figure to the cab as well. Modifications were also done to the locomotive as well to make it look a bit more realistic. The old steam dome was removed and replaced with a steam dome off of a Tyco Mantua 460 locomotive. I also put on new brass check valves and water pumps as well that looked like the Schenectady style ones on the Jupiter. After that, I reassembled the engine, and this is how it looked as it was completed. Let's move on to the Union Pacific 119. The 119 ended up not needing too much of a rebuild like the Jupiter did to look more accurate. All I really did for the locomotive was remove the old crude bell and replace it with this brass cast metal piece for the locomotive. I ended up repainting the tender wheels. I will note, however, you see that the tender trucks themselves have not been repainted and are still black. That's because I don't have the proper burgundy-ish color or the wine red color that the locomotive's tender trucks uses. Whenever I can find paint that's close enough to that, I will end up finishing the 119's tender trucks. Besides that, I also ended up staining the wood cab, and I used a method that works really, really well that Red Oak Trains had made a video on, which I'll link here. It just is a really, really good method. It just looks fantastic. Anyways, moving on after that, I painted the stacks cap black to look like the replicas as it does currently, and I painted the boiler braces on this one as well. I also excruciatingly put on the pinstriping on all the wheels as well. This was a nightmare to do because I didn't have a way to run the wheels while I was painting them, so I had to painstakingly paint all around the wheel manually and then clean up the white paint as I went along the wheels. Absolute nightmare, but at the end of it, it's absolutely well worth it because it makes the model look 10 times better. It just looks so much better than how it started out looking as. And then to finish off the model, I ended up painting the little murals that the 119 locomotive has painted on the sand domes and on the back of the tender as well. These aren't really super detailed. You know, I used really fine brushes to just try and get the general look of how these paintings look on the domes and on the tender. I tried to match them up as best as I could. I think they came out pretty decent. I might do some touch-ups on them later down the road to try and make them look a bit better. But for now, I think they came out pretty decent. They look a lot better than just the basic-looking paint schemes that Bachmann had put on the locomotives. I still have to find an engineer figure to put in the cab. However, that's about it for the locomotive. Anyways, though, I want to thank everybody for watching this video. I had an absolute blast working on these models. I'm really happy with how they've come out. I definitely can recommend doing this to your models if you have the Bachmann Jupiter and 119 and want to make them look a bit better. You don't need a ton of skills to really do this. You just need to have patience and be really careful. Just make sure you're watering down the acrylic paints and use really fine brushes, and your models will probably come out just fine. Anyways, though, thanks for watching, and here's a montage of the locomotives running to close out the video.